There are a good amount of people who could tell you how the MLS began, but our story begins before the 1994 World Cup. The history of the World's Game in America is, like a lot of things, complicated and chaotic. You have multiple leagues popping up in the same time with their own domestic cups, all fighting for supremacy in the same region, leagues that applied to FIFA to be a professional status and represent the United States at the same time, a so-called soccer war, and even Pele was hanging out in New York. We have a lot of work to do before we get to that World Cup bid. There is a lot of debate as to when the first organized game of football was actually played in the United States. Many of the early versions of football were actually only resembling the game in terms of ball shape and kicking. Boston game, as it eventually became known, was started in 1862 by some of the more wealthy students of the East Coast's more prestigious schools at the time. This included Garrett Smith Miller, a graduate of Latin School of Epes Sergeant Dixwell. Yeah, Garrett and many other members of private schools in the area would actually go on to create Oneida FC. Many of these students were actually said to be close with their family in the UK, or at least close enough that they were influenced to start the club by visits to their family in England. Just to add a little bit to the craziness, it is actually reported that a lot of these early meetings were happening in a Freemason lodge. I add this just because it kind of goes to show the difference in how the game was created in America as opposed to the rest of the world, where in most of the world it was more of an everyman game as opposed to a pastime for the elite. And it should be repeated that the rules of this game were much different, and many people agree that despite the influence and history, Oneida FC really wasn't the first true football club in America. But the foundation was set. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very sturdy foundation. Thankfully, it didn't take too long for the game to turn into something more recognizable. The earliest recorded game I could find was actually in October 11th, 1866 in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Shout out to the home state. Reported on by the Waukesha Freeman, this game was played under the 1863 London Football Association laws. The game was referred to as football, and every goal was actually called a game, which makes me feel almost like they were comparing the game to tennis in some weird way, but I don't even know if it was around back then. Some of the stranger rules they used in 1863 included the following. There was no crossbars, goals were as high as they wanted to be, there was no corner kick, players were allowed to catch the ball but not allowed to run with it, there was no keepers, and teams switched side after every goal. After every game. The game would actually end with Carroll College coming out on top 5-2, and they were not the only university hoping to expand the game in the country. It was around this time, maybe a year or so later, that many of the four-year universities in the area started to field teams in more organized games, and it was starting to resemble more and more of a league here. In 1869, Princeton would actually play Rutgers, with the rules closely following the FA rule set at the time, and it was at this point that the game was really starting to grow in popularity, especially in the areas on the east coast of early America with high population counts of immigrants from Europe. Prestigious schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Cornell were all starting to see growing interest from their student bodies to play more and more. And cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, St. Louis, Cleveland were all starting to see growing involvement in their local rec leagues, especially from, again, the previously aforementioned immigrant populations that they had. There was a movement to make soccer, as it was called back then, a more popular sport, as well as with European teams being invited to tour in 1905, 1907, and 1909. However, despite these strong early efforts, ultimately, American football would wind up ruling supreme over the college scene for years to come. But how? The beginnings of creating an organized governing body in America can unfortunately be described most easily as messy. As early as 1886, many of the textile plants in Fall Rivers, Massachusetts had started a Bristol County League for the numerous English immigrant workers at the factories and plants. At the same time, St. Louis, alongside help with the Catholic Church, yes, the Catholic Church, would actually start their own big rec league, albeit with some modified rules. Heading into 1884, The game in America was really just governed at the regional level with no national body to oversee any sort of standardization or organization amongst the many leagues that were starting to pop up at this time. That would ultimately all change with the beginning of the American Football Association. Focused on the East Coast, they sought to standardize games and leagues for New York and New Jersey, eventually reaching out to include Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, to include a couple others. The AFA would ultimately go on to become the oldest sports league operating in America, had it been able to continue operations. Overseeing all league operations for the region, they would even go on to create the American Cup in 1884, one of the first non-regional tournaments to be held in American soil. This would actually go on to be running until 1924 and would be dominated by teams from Massachusetts and New Jersey for its first 12 years. The first challenger to the AFA's governing status would actually be the ALPFB, or the American League of Professional Football. The ALPFB was started by a group of owners from professional baseball as a way to generate revenue in the off-season when these stadiums would normally be empty. This was actually met with heavy resistance from the AFA, who would go on to place a ban on any player who would sign a contract with this newly formed organization. And despite solid financial backing, the league would ultimately fail to attract any real players and would quickly fold after just 17 days. So, good fight, I guess. Smaller leagues would actually start popping up, including the National Association Football League, or NAFBL, a semi-pro league which would operate from 1895 to 1898, later returning from 1906 to 1921, which consisted of teams from New York and New Jersey. But little records really exist of this league, so I really can't expand much further on that other than their early story. But just so you know, it's not the end of their involvement in this big tale. Heading into the turn of the century, interest in soccer was faltering and the AFA would suspend the American Cup from 1899 to 1906. The cup would start up again after European teams would tour the United States following invites from Harvard and the universities I previously mentioned. This was all in an effort to try and restart the soccer movement in the United States. Unfortunately for the AFA, they weren't the only group that noticed this renewed interest in soccer in the country. The biggest issue actually facing the AFA at the time was the refusal to spread from the New England region of the United States. And in 1911, they would actually finally come face to face with their biggest competitors to date, the American Amateur Football Association, or the AAFA. This semi-pro league would quickly become national and start to put pressure on the AFA to do something to keep their hold as the league, and a year later they made the move. In 1912, the AFA would apply to FIFA to be recognized as the governing body in America for professional soccer, using their status as the oldest organization in the country to stake their claim. However, they were not the only ones to make this move, and the newly founded AAFA would actually do the same, stating they were the only true national organization in America. FIFA was quick to deny both applicants, essentially telling them they needed to get their shit together and reapply when they figured out what the one organization was gonna be. And while I would love to tell you a dramatic story of a long drawn out competitive league battling it out for supremacy, it honestly wouldn't take that long for a clear winner to emerge. In 1913, just 1 year removed from the FIFA bid, multiple members of the AFA would defect over to the AAFA, and on April 5th, 1913, the AAFA would become the United States Football Association, and FIFA was quick to approve their next bid. America finally had a national body recognized by FIFA, actually becoming the first from North or Central America to do so. That fall, the USFA would actually begin the National Challenge Cup, and it finally seemed like American soccer would have a period of growth and stability. So, for a few years heading into the 1920s, there was a somewhat quiet period with the semi-pro/amateur USFA continuing operations and running the National Challenge Cup alongside the faltering AFA and their American Cup. Now, at this point, the NAFBL, remember them, were getting frustrated at being forced to remain at the semi-pro/amateur level, and in 1921 they would actually join forces with some of the other northeastern leagues and would form the first fully professional organization, the American Soccer League. And as a result, the soccer wars were about to get underway. The ASL quickly would grow to outshine the USFA. as they were formed primarily out of frustrations with their management of the league. Primarily operating out of the Northeast, the ASL would require Thomas Cahill as their first secretary. Thomas was not only crucial in founding the USFA, but was also the first national team head coach for the USA. By 1924, the first professional league in America had become so popular that they were actually able to draw in players from England and Ireland and numerous other foreign nations, with a total of 50 European international players choosing to play in America at the time. This was also the final year of the AFA and the National Challenge Cup, as they would soon fold after this season, and the USFA's Amateur Cup would later become the Challenge Cup, turned out to be the new domestic cup for America. This did not make everyone happy, however, as European resentment from the quickly growing American League would lead FIFA to threaten the ASL, including the threat of USFA's expulsion from FIFA. Ultimately, on June 4th, 1927, the USFA would meet with other members of FIFA and work out an agreement putting limits on the transfers and foreign players in the ASL. This wouldn't be the last time the ASL would start upsetting some people, as continued issues with the timing of the National Challenge Cup led to a protest of the competition in 1924. Since the extended travel was causing a toll on teams, they would rejoin the cup after a year after being promised bigger gate revenue splits for the tournament games. It would be a few years later, however, in 1927, where things would finally completely boil over. New York Nationals owner Charles Stoneham would propose an ASL-only alternative to the Challenge Cup. Instead of allowing anyone to just play, the proposed changes would expand the league to the Midwest and create two divisions of games, which would end in a playoff to end the season. It's important to note that prior to this, the ASL was already being sanctioned by FIFA for signing European players already under contract with teams in Europe. This, plus claims of corruption, forced the USFA president to appear in Helsinki for a hearing from FIFA. At this point, the ASL was planning on boycotting the National Challenge Cup once again in 1928. However, this time, 3 ASL teams, including one of the more successful clubs, the Bethlehem Steel FC, would not side with the league and would choose to still participate in the cup. The ASL would respond to this by suspending the 3 clubs and fining them $1,000. Or $18,000 in today's money. As a result, the USFL and FIFA would declare the ASL an outlaw league, and would lead to the ultimate downfall of the ASL. The 3 suspended teams would quickly leave the ASL and work with some of the local teams in the regional league of the SNYSA, or the Southern New York Soccer Association. Working together, they would go on to form the Eastern Professional Soccer League. The ESL was bankrolled by the USFA to directly compete with the ASL Outlaws, who were banking the name on name value and lack of restrictions to attract players. However, not all of the SNYSA's teams would join the ESL, as the league's president and ASL club Brooklyn Wanderers owner Nat Agar would take the remaining clubs from the regional league and actually sign with the ASL, claiming that FIFA's rules were too restrictive and would rather run the league more like professional baseball. Prior to the ESL, it really seemed like the outlaw leagues would win, but in the end, a lack of stability from a regulating body and a huge financial drain from having a direct competitor in the same market simply forced the ASL to bend the knee and abide by USFA and FIFA regulations. Following this, in 1929, the ASL and ESL merged, becoming the Spring-Fall Atlantic Coast League, later renamed to the American Soccer League during its inaugural summer break, therefore becoming the first league in history to finish the season under a different name than what it began with. In the end, USFA and FIFA's win would actually prove to be truly damaging moments in the growth and popularity of the sport in America. In a lot of people's eyes, the ASL versus USFA and FIFA was seen almost as an upstart American league being smothered by these pretentious and overbearing European interference. And a lot of people turned their back to the game, feeling that it was never going to truly be an American sport from this moment on, feeling that we would never be able to break out from underneath this oppressive European regime governing the game. While this ultimately halted the promising start of soccer in America, just like most things in this beautiful, beautiful country of mine, it simply wouldn't die. Now, If you know your history, you know what America is about to go through in 1929. And just 2 weeks after the merger between the ASL and the ESL, the Great Depression would begin. And in the period of incredible struggle that would follow, this ultimately led to the downfall of the short-lived league. Multiple teams would fold and the league itself would dissolve. And despite an attempted relaunch of the league spearheaded by some of the most successful clubs in the league, they simply just could not generate any interest, they couldn't generate any revenue, and they couldn't draw any big names from Europe or anywhere else to come play just like a few years earlier. Ultimately, what this would mean is that from now until after World War II, the domestic scene was simply nothing more than a cup competition full of semi-pro and amateur sides and the occasional international match against a bunch of college players. One of the darker periods in the sports history in the country. Going through 1945 with the Second World War ending and the world attempting to move forward, soccer had all but disappeared from the public eye in America. The USFA would change from the United States Football Association to the United States Soccer Football Association, as American football had become a major sport and their league was overshadowing the original football. It wouldn't be until 1967 that the USA got to see a new attempt at a professional game, with the United Soccer Association and the National Professional Soccer League being formed in the same year. The United Soccer Association was aimed at setting up franchises of established European and South American clubs in America. Some of the partnerships would have included Shamrock Rovers and Boston Rovers, that one seems pretty obvious to me, Stoke City and the Cleveland Stokers, sure, and Cagliari Calcio and Chicago Mustangs. Sure, man. The NSPL, meanwhile, was completely America and Canada based, attempted to implement some different league rules to encourage interest. These rules being 6 points for a win, 3 points for a draw, and 0 for a loss. You would also get a bonus point for each of your team's first 3 goals to start every year. Ultimately, both leagues would merge after just one season to form the NASL, or the North American Soccer League. This was a good thing. From 1968 to 1984, the NASL would proudly carry the torch for professional soccer in America, and they would include some of the biggest names in the world, including Cruyff, George Best, and the one and only Pele. I think we can all agree the NASL needs its own story time. Honestly, I did not expect this video to take this long to put together, and I was very surprised at just the sheer amount of information I had to take in and just how complicated this sports history actually is in this country. Learning about things like the ASL and all that stuff and the outlaw leagues that were popping up was just absolutely crazy to me, and I thought it was actually pretty interesting. If you want me to take a closer look at the ASL and some of these other early leagues and maybe some of the cup competitions, please just leave a comment down below, and I don't know, we'll see. Maybe we'll get a short story, a short video on the ASL and how they actually operated behind the scenes. Anyways, the next video is actually going to be a deep dive into the NASL and how they operated, how they managed to bring guys like Cruyff, Pele, and all these guys in, because I truly believe this is one of the most important periods in American soccer's history. Yes, I keep saying American soccer. Why? Because it feels weird calling it football, and if I feel like if I say American soccer, somehow you guys don't want to castrate me for saying soccer instead of football. But I don't know, get over your shit. Anyways, thank you guys so much for hanging out. I hope you learned something today. Go win a trivia game with your buddies. I don't know, man. Drop a like, drop a sub. It's completely free. It helps me not get a big boy job and keep doing this for you guys, which I'm actually starting to enjoy more and more. So thank you guys so much. It helps me out massively. Hope to see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves.